me and Evelyn will talk about cognitive bias and ranking and how it can foster ineffective architecture and design, or eating your lunch. That's also a very nice one. And we always like to start with a somehow personal story, and this personal story this time is from me. I'm going to take you a bit outside IT and more towards my previous relationship. And then afterwards, I'll tell you, of course, why I would start with my previous relationship. So I'm an engineer, software engineer, actually started electrical engineering, and this was my flowchart, right? I saw a gap, and I'll just fix the gap, and it's solved, right? So I did the same with my previous relationship. Didn't end up quite well, and that's mostly thanks to me, of course, because what I did there is we were unhappy, and instead of finding out why we were unhappy, I was looking at the gap, and I saw happier people around me, happier couples. So it's like, okay, I got to fix this. I'm going to do what they will do, right? I'm going to copy paste what they are doing. And that's what I actually did. And but the problem here is a relationship is really complex. And we're using the complexity word from Kinevin here. And when things go bad, we have to endure, observe, and see what we can change and probe. And we don't need to go chasing a happy to be situation. And that's what I did. And well, you know, I don't think if I did this, it will end up good for me, but at least I will sooner find out that I needed to break the relationship. And this is all thanks to me dealing with complexity in a bad way. And I learned a lot. And nowadays, it's a lot more happy. I'm happily married. But this metaphor, Evelyn, what has to do with software? So let's go to software architecture, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's a nice one. And actually, what we see happening in a lot of organizations and a lot of companies that we're in is that this chasing of these happy to be situations and creating them in the complex environments that we actually are working in, that's happening as well. We see stuff that's working at other companies, so we start doing it as well. And this copy-paste hell is actually mutating in our experience. So everything that you see here on the slide, you're probably familiar with. Maybe you're using it as well. But what we very often see is that we go start copy-pasting these things, and then we will be happy as a company or as a team or whatever. And we see this a lot, but unfortunately, it's not very often working out in the best way possible. And the reason for that, and what makes things even worse at some points, is that we are combining these happy to be paths. So we think we will be double as happy if we copy paste actually more than we actually can handle. So the approach doesn't work because we live in very complex environments. We work in very complex environments. And we tend to deal with this complexity in a pretty suboptimal manner, let's say. So we tend to treat these complex environments that we're in as complicated, something that we can change very easily and very quickly. That's also what Kenny tried to do in his relationship. It didn't work, doesn't work for a lot of companies. And the main reason that this goes wrong is that we are dealing with something called socio-technical systems. And basically, this means that we are dealing with three aspects, socio and technical. That's kind of in the name already, but there is also the cognitive aspects from a socio-technical system. And when things are very complex, we cannot just solve this gap. We really need to listen to a system. We need to inspect and adapt. We need to probe. We can't just copy-paste stuff. We really need to find a way of balancing all three aspects, the socio, the technical, and the cognitive one, because they all influence each other. They all impact each other. And if we make a technical decision, there are implications for the social aspects. How are our teams organized? What behavior is required in that sense? And we have to be very aware of that. And a very nice example that probably everyone in this session is familiar with are the open office spaces, because they definitely improve communication. But is that really true, Kenny?
Yeah, so going into that open office space, to give you a concrete example of how to still not work entirely in software, but we're dealing with this ourselves, right? Well, maybe we're going back to the office again. Maybe you're hybrid now. Luckily, not dealing too much with this open office space. But when we ask this to audiences, and we can see them, roughly 60 to 80% don't like them. And there's a reason for them. But there's also a reason why they exist. Because the reason why an open office space exists is that it can improve communication, but it depends on your culture. So there's a nice talk from Joe Wright at Lean Agile Scotland, and he goes into the history of open office spaces, right? And he found out that the open office space that improved communication was designed together by the people in the open office space, right? They're saying, well, we need to do this, we have a problem, let's solve and let's probe and see what works. Similar to roughly maybe the Spotify model, right? They did it themselves because they designed it themselves and it would work for them. Well, that's a debate on the Spotify model, but for the open office space, it worked, right? It succeeded. But then other companies saw that and they will start copy pasting it in their environment, and it didn't work. Why? People, right? Always these people. And if you read Accelerate, right? You saw Nicole Sforgan saying investment in technology, in this case in the open office space, right? The hardware of that thing is also an investment in people. And these investments will make our technology process more sustainable. That's why social technical systems. So if you look at it from an architectural perspective, we do it ourselves in designing monoliths, right? A lot of monoliths nowadays, people call them monoliths and call them bad, but monoliths are actually quite good pattern. It's the big ball of mud you're worried about. Because if we design a monolith and we don't put model boundaries in, or the wrong boundaries, same as the open office space, you just architected that open office space for a software team. So too much noise, too much cognitive load going on there, and nobody knows where the boundaries are anymore. And that's what we still need. We need that habitability. We need that habitability in our open office space. We have that at home, right? Habitability. And this is a nice slide from Kevin Henley, right? And in our software, we want that as well. We want to feel at home in the open office space, but also when we're dealing with software architecture. The thing about these boundaries that we're talking about, right, these social boundaries as well, is that they're soft. Because if they're a lot harder, like you will see in the next slide, you'll see if they're misaligned, right, or if they're not great. So, right, if someone goes out of that door and falls down, you will know it's painful. But in a social environment, social technical environment, they're more soft, and you would hear that, but people are resilient, so we'll be fine, right? So you don't see that. And all these examples make sense, by the way, from a planning perspective. We know that, but at least we see it's misaligned and we do something about them. By the way, I think the Trust Me, I'm an Architect was deliverable, but it's still really fun. And that's the thing about architectural design. We usually really like to talk about software boundaries as in application boundaries because they're hard, they're simpler. But architectural design is system design, which is contextual design, right? It's about boundaries, it's about what's in, what's out, and what spans and moves in between, and about trade-offs. And me coming from the domain-driven design community, we talk a lot about the bounded context. And the thing here is people generally confuse the bounded context again for a hard technical boundary. No, it's a social boundary. It's a linguistic boundary mostly. It's a social and technical thing. And this is harder for us because it's a people thing, right? You need the social part, and there's a lot of problems in that social part. There's a lot of problems about these social boundaries. So I'm going to take you as an example of this. I'm going to take you to the south, so of the Netherlands. I live more in the middle part, and this is close by where Evelyn lives actually. And this is close by the Belgium with, well, it's actually the border with Belgium. It's Baarle-Nassau. And you see the lady there who is crossing the border between the Netherlands and Belgium. Now you see that border passing and going straight through that shop, which is called the Zeeman. The thing is, at some point at the early start, Belgium went on total lockdown and the Netherlands didn't. So they needed to set up hard boundaries in their application. And this is what's happening if your boundaries aren't correctly set up, like we mostly do, right? And people get familiar with that as in that's Conway's law for you a bit, but the way Ruth Malan explains is brilliant, right? If the architecture of the system, in this case the shop, and the architecture of the organization, country boundaries are at odds, the architecture of the organization wins. Yeah, this is just a fact that is happening. So you might as well bring in that organizational perspective, right? The organizational problems, which is a social problem. Organization is part of the social domain in social technical. You need to bring that in, right? And you want to create a shared sense of reality, right, Evelyn?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things, and we focus a lot on that. So eventually the goal is to create this shared sense of reality amongst everyone who's relevant and who should be involved. And this sounds very obvious, it sounds very trivial, we know that, but very often it's not explicit, and we live in different worlds, let's say. We're using different kinds of language, different references, different realities, in fact. And if we do that, if we are not fully aligned on the problem that we are dealing with or the solution that we're working on, then there's a lot of room for assumptions, cognitive bias, and ranking at play. And one of the things that you could use here in order to get to that shared sense of reality is visual collaboration. We are actually huge fans of that as well. So things like EventStorming, but really visualizing what you're doing, that can help in facilitating that shared understanding. So in the DDD community, domain-driven design, the visual and collaborative modeling is a very important aspect. It really helps in creating that shared sense of reality by including all of the relevant perspectives, knowledge, domain experts, and it provides an opportunity to listen to each other. So it also provides an opportunity to spot, recognize, and encounter cognitive biases if necessary. But that means we need the right people in the room. That means we have to collaborate with each other. It means we have to socialize and we have to talk to each other and deal with humans. And that's not always pleasant, obviously. We know that. But someone should be in charge here, right? Someone should be leading that. And who should that be? Well, in our opinion, we feel that a socio-technical architect is needed. And that's a role, not a function. And we deliberately say that because otherwise there will be ranking involved as well. And we will get back to that later in this talk. We really need this socio-technical architect, someone who's able to balance both the social, technical, and the cognitive bias aspect in this sense, and takes ownership on this. And we will dive into what's necessary and some of the challenges that you can encounter when you're dealing with this, right, Kenny?
Yeah. So when you're as an architect, especially in agile architecture, right, it's more about collaboration, inspecting and adapting. So putting people in the room together and collaborate on it is a lot more effective. It's a lot more sustainable to making the correct decision, right? You have instant buy-in, you have the total thinking power of the entire group, but it's hard because how do we actually make sure all that knowledge comes up, right? How can we create and include that new insights from the different people? Who decides on the architecture now that we have all the people in the room, and how to get everyone on board, and who to invite, and how to deal with the issues that keep cycling back, right? There's always these issues that some person wants to go really deep and the other one just wants to complete the whole assessment, right? These are things that keep coming back. So how would you deal with it? These are new capabilities an architect, in our opinion, should learn, right? They should learn to facilitate, lead by example. And we're going to go through all these, and we're going to start first with ensuring the flow in the meeting about how to make sure everyone said what has to be said, right? So Evelyn, how can we do that?
Yeah, and this is an example, a screenshot that we took from one of our workshops that we do. This is a sense-making exercise, and basically we ask the questions to everyone in the workshop, and we ask them to place a dot somewhere on this, this frame. And the reason that we ask these questions specifically is to get an understanding or better understanding of the ranking that's going on in the group, because we all recognize that, right? We're in a session and some people are talking a lot, maybe some people are not saying anything at all, some people are always in the background, some people are always taking the stage. There's always stuff going on when it comes to these dynamics. And all of the questions here have a relationship with something called ranking, and that's the first thing that we're going to discuss in this session. And ranking is a phenomenon that we all have experience with, and in itself, it's not a bad thing. Sometimes it has this negative association, but it's not a bad thing in itself, because ranking, just like cognitive biases, just like stereotypes, they help us make sense of the world, right? So, but whether it's hindering us or helping us, that depends on our own personal rank and the situations that we're in. So ranking is also very much present in collaborative modeling sessions. Like I said, it determines who speaks more, who takes the lead, who expresses an opinion, who chooses not to express an opinion, that sort of stuff. And there's a lot to say about that, but in this talk, we want to give you the highlights so that you can at least recognize what's going on in the sessions that you're part of. And the first thing that we have to understand is that there's a difference between explicit ranking and implicit ranking. And the explicit ranking is probably familiar. It's your position in the organizational chart, your job title, do you have a management function, let's say, your job description, the formal level of power that you have. But the implicit ranking is very much present as well, and is very much determining and influencing how these sessions flow, let's say. And the implicit ranking is really about your gender, your skin color, your level of charisma, the informal level of power that you have, and that sort of stuff. And at the top of the slide, once upon a time, there were a tall white guy and a woman in IT. That's obviously based on some facts here. Kenny and I do a lot of trainings and sessions and consultancy together. And we encounter this ranking very often. So, and again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It helps us determine where we stand in comparison to the rest of the group. But as for an example, not that long ago, Kenny and I were in a workshop, and I was explaining something, doing a part of the workshop, and there was this one person who would just address all of the questions to Kenny. And it was maybe me who was just explained something, but all the questions went to Kenny. And in that case, I was very lucky that Kenny was aware of his rank, because that allowed him to share it with me and say, okay, but you mean the things that Evelyn just explained. So maybe Evelyn can answer this better because, well, she's the expert on this. But that means that if Kenny was not aware of his rank, then he couldn't have shared it with me, and it could make me feel bad, right? So being aware of your own rank, so where you are compared to the rest of the group, that influences also how you position yourself, and you can very much benefit from that. And ranking goes on in real life a lot. So we have a couple of Twitter examples here as well. I have way more examples on it as well as a woman in IT. And again, it's not a bad thing. It helps me as well. It helps me determine what my position is. It even helps me in making sense of meetings that I'm in. It helps me understand why certain people might not share their perspectives and might not share their opinion. And a lot of knowledge can go lost in that sense. So for me, it's very important to know and understand how the ranking works in a certain session, so that I can help others in sharing their rank and that sort of stuff. So the thing about ranking is that we are doing this to ourselves, let's say. And again, that sounds a bit negative, but something called symbolic violence is explaining that. And that's a kind of a theoretical aspect, but it's very useful to know what's going on. So how do we determine our own rank and the ranking of others? The thing is that we are all conditioned to have a symbolic ideal, let's say. And that symbolic ideal is an image of what is considered dominant and strong, and what is considered dominated and weak. And that's not a judgment. Again, this is just how society is wired. And the symbolic ideal also changes over time. So you can think about the clothes that you're wearing, or the watch that you're wearing, the car that you drive, where you live, that sort of stuff. They're all traits on a very infinite list. And what we do very quickly when we meet someone or when we are in a group, we compare our own situation to how we perceive the situation of this other person. And the more traits that someone have, the more power, let's say, so the higher in rank that person is in our perspective. Again, it's something we do to ourselves. That's the symbolic violence part. Again, that sounds also a bit, there's no physical violence involved there in any way. But this is what made me kind of feel bad when all the questions in that workshop went to Kenny. I was like, okay, so I'm lower in position here. I'm lower in rank. But I did that to myself because I scored myself compared to the other persons. So it's really useful to know what's going on there. And if you do that, so if you notice that you're feeling bad, then a concept that we're using for that is that you are hitting yourself. And that's where the violence comes from. And our friend Romeo has a very nice example and related concept on that. And that's the pair programming or a mob session where one of the participants is hitting oneself is not a co-creation, it's submission. And this is, for example, when you are doing a pair programming session and you are lower in rank, then you might have the feeling, okay, I'm not sharing my opinion because the other person will know better probably. That person knows more about it, has way more experience than I have. I'm just around for a few months. I will just shut up. But in that sense, you are missing a lot of relevant knowledge and a lot of relevant information that you want to include in your solution. And that's also what we try to get on the table in the collaborative modeling sessions that we have. We try to see what's going on in terms of ranking. Sometimes we even make it explicit. You have tools for that. But try to see what's going on, and it might explain a lot. And if you are higher in rank, then you also know that it might be very useful to share that rank, and maybe sometimes just shut up because you want to leave the floor to others to leave their contribution.
I think everyone can relate to that. That you say, well, I'll probably not say anything because I'm the least knowledgeable person in the room, so I won't share. But that fresh perspective, right? We sometimes need and want to change it.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, definitely need that. Yeah, and then maybe one thing well, that's just for yourself that you can do after the session. The game that's called Turn It Around. These shirts are weird, right? The engineer, the male engineer. Kenny and I actually have 2 shirts as well, where it says with me architect, and Kenny has the male architect. And if you encounter something like this and you think, hey, that's weird, then some form of ranking is at play. And there are way more examples to think about this as well. You also probably never read in a newspaper headline that a big corporate company hired a male CEO. And that sort of stuff it can get you thinking. But the most important thing about ranking is be aware mainly of your own rank within a group, and know that if you are higher in rank than the rest of the group, then you will have a lot of influence on the outcome, on the decisions, on the solution, on the problem, and everything in between. So that's something that you should be aware of. But why actually, Kenny? If you're higher in rank, why would you care?
Yeah, so what, right? Especially when you're an architect, you're usually in a situation where you're higher in a sort of ranking, right? If you're with a team, it's already organizational usually that you're higher. But so what, right? I can just take my decisions and go. The thing about making these decisions, and I have a nice example, but the thing about architecture is most models or most design are always wrong, right? It's a George Box quote, because we're creating abstractions. So you want to have the best possible model for the situation, or the best possible design. So you want to have all the knowledge available to make that decision. The only thing is, if higher people in ranking and lower people in ranking, if you don't share that information, so what? What's happening? So everyone probably knows this example. When I just started in an organization and I was lower in rank, and they will say, well, this is how you should do it, right? We're building this continuous delivery as a service team, and they're providing you with all sorts of information, and this is what you should use, right? This Jenkins pipeline, etc., etc. The problem with that there is that we were building iOS devices which weren't able to work with that. So what would we do? We walked around the corner, went to a shop, bought an Apple, and plugged it into the network, and we had shadow IT, right? At least we could have tested now our Apple devices. But this is what it does with authoritative decision making. They always cause some form of resistance, and it says sabotage line, resistance line. There's many words, but people are saying, well, especially architects, how do I deal with this resistant behavior, right? It starts with jokes, sarcastic jokes, but exclusive gossiping. At some point, they stop communicating, they're slowing down, they're actually disrupting. They're buying new shadow IT devices, and that's not what actually you decided, right? But they don't see the fear, and they don't see the, probably something you relate to, right? You made a decision for the better good in your opinion, which makes sense, but well, something happened here, and that's what we call the sabotage line. And when you're in a group, you see this line walking, right? You see the jokes, you see the sarcastic jokes, and there again, as Evelyn mentioned before, just like ranking, these are just common things we do, which doesn't mean they're bad, doesn't mean they're good. It's just our way of coping with some situations, right? And they can be perfectly fine. But if a certain topic gets a lot of sarcastic jokes, then you need to be careful, right? When we were in groups, people are always making sarcastic joke about the merger that was going on between their company and the other company, right? Constantly. So we went into that, and there was some knowledge that they weren't sharing, because they're saying, yeah, we get all these people come in and they expect us to do this thing, but they don't know that we already had it. So, right, you're losing out on all of knowledge. And that's the thing with autocratic decisions, they suppress knowledge and wisdom, and they create resistance by default. This is what you always need to deal with. So be sure that if you take a decision without the other person involved or buying, it will create resistance. So your question should be, how much resistance can I handle, and is it okay or not, and how do I conclude? Right? So a question here is usually to the audience, and this is where usually you really see it go bad, right? But what do you see? And usually the people now say, well, that bird is one bird is on one feet or paw, and the other bird is the other way around. And that's the thing. We all probably either are this person that's weird, or we know a person in a group who's weird. And we usually try to remove that person from the group, right? Because they're weird. They have weird ideas. What is it? We call it Harry in the Netherlands. Well, actually, that comes from Danielle and Jitske. They actually set this in a group, this concept of group think, and people outside the group come in and feel weird. And they say, ah, yeah, that's Harry in our group. Ooh, awkward, right? So that's why the bird is now representing Harry, the person that has knowledge that the rest doesn't share. Because the thing is, if you see people dancing and you don't hear the music, it sounds weird. They sound insane, but you cannot hear the music. Maybe the music is really good. Maybe it's really bad, like the stuff they sometimes make today, but it can be really good, right? And that's what you're missing out on. It's valuable information. So whenever you feel like, what a weird comment, no, let's just ignore it. Stop and see what you're missing. Because there's a ranking at play. You're higher in rank because you could say stop, right? You can say stop. No, we're ignoring that. We're moving on. But the second thing is you're missing out on a lot of knowledge, and this is happening a lot in modeling sessions, right? We neglect the lower in ranking. And I've been in teams where people believe that they're really at the same rank, right? Well, if you're at the daily, we're all the same, right? No, you're not, because that other person next to you might think that they're less than you, and they will shut up when you speak. So just know your rank, and when you know you have a tech lead or an architectural position that gives more rank by default, and Evelyn already said this, right? Own, play, and share your rank. So own your rank. There's nothing so condescending to other people as to not own the rank you have, right? You cannot tell as a CEO to the cleaning person saying, yeah, we're equal, right? No, you decide on budgets and money. They cannot, right? It's similar that a parent says, I'm equal to my 4-year-old. You're not. You tell the 4-year-old when they need to go to bed. So own that rank, right? If you have it, own it, but then share it with each other, right? Share it with the people you want it. Ask for their opinion. And then play around with it, right? Where are my boundaries? Where are they? So this is the thing. If you know you're in higher rank, please share it and give other people more the opportunity to work around. So if you're in a pair, you have more experience, let that person make a mistake. They will learn from it, and you will learn from it. And I've been in that position myself as well. I had that opportunity with someone 10 years more in programming, and he listened to me and he supported me with my faults, right? Because that person knew, oh, he can make that mistake, and we can clear it, and he will learn, and we'll be better, and we can. It doesn't fit. It's filled to safe to fill, right? So if you want to do that, please share your rank. So Evelyn, now that we have all this knowledge together, how do we include and create new insight, right? Do we still get everything there, or should we look at other things as well?
Yes, time to dive into one of my all-time favorite topics, cognitive bias. I will give it away. Cognitive bias is everywhere. And again, not a bad thing. These cognitive biases are our way of thinking, the way that we have a system 1 and a system 2, which I will go into a bit. It all helps us processing all the information that comes at us on a daily basis. If you would have to think about every single decision that you are taking every day, then you would have no time left to do anything else. And cognitive bias is something that can really help you in making quick and effective decisions. because sometimes you've done over and over again, you have a lot of experience, and you can pretty much do them on an automatic pilot, right? So the reason that sometimes when you're driving a car and after a few minutes you think, oh, I'm already here. Okay, I was not very much aware of what I did to get here. That's where also your cognitive bias and your system 1, so your automatic pilot, comes in. And you spend a lot of time with that system 1. It's really fast. It's based on your intuition. And it helps you making very quick and effective decisions in almost every case. Your system 1, you spend way less time with that, but that's more of the rational system, the thing that the system that you use when you really have to make some deliberate choices and deliberate decisions, and you really have to slow down and think about stuff. This is also the place where you might want to encounter some of the cognitive biases, because cognitive biases in most cases are very valuable, but in some cases, for example, when it comes to collaborative modeling sessions, they can also really harm you and slow you down. You can spend a lot of time studying cognitive biases. I did for a few years. There are lots of them, but it's really helpful to at least know and being able to recognize a few of them. So Kenny and I do a lot of workshops, as said, and we see some of the cognitive biases pop up almost all the time, and they are almost always present in the sessions that we do. And we want to walk you through a few of them, starting off with the functional fixedness. And this is about getting stuck in what you know. And this is really a mental block against using something in a new way that is required to solve a problem. So for example, in the workshops that Kenny and I do about domain-driven design, for example, and we also do example mapping, and we ask people to come up with solutions related to a cinema domain. And what we see happening is everyone has the same image, the same mental model of a cinema. There are rows, the chairs are usually red, they are going up in some sort of a stair, the movie screen is in front of you. We all have this idea of what a cinema looks like. And that's what we use as a starting point, but it also hinders us in thinking about the problem in new ways. And this is again why the so-called Hari, the weird person, is very important, because they can help us to get out of this functional fixedness. So the example that we see here on the slide, the restaurant, well, we needed to have these 1.5 meters in between tables. How are we going to do that? And how do we make sure that we are still well organized in an optimal manner so that we can still make money? There was probably someone who said, well, maybe we can just put people on top of each other or tables on top of each other. Well, that's a bit weird. Yeah, sure. But the model it wrong part here eventually led to this. And I think it's pretty amazing. But this is how you might want to get out of that functional fixedness. So model it wrong is a very cool thing to do when you're in a session and just deliberately come up with the most crazy ideas that you have and then see what you can use of it. A second cognitive bias that is very present in, well, not only collaborative modeling sessions, but basically in any conversation, is the anchoring effect. And that means that we think relatively rather than objectively. And we have this tendency to, when the first piece of information comes to the table, we rely on that. That's our anchor. Someone says something, and that's the anchor that's being dropped. And we adjust to that. And especially if a person higher in rank speaks first, drops the anchor, then that's our anchor, and we will move towards that anchor. So maybe you were discussing a deadline for something, and you think, well, I think this will take about, well, maybe 2 months. But the first person that speaks says 2 weeks. So what you do, you move towards that anchor that's being dropped. So you have to be very careful and very conscious about the anchors that you are dropping in any meeting. And especially if you're higher in rank, I would recommend that you don't drop your anchor first, because you have to be aware that everyone will move towards you and towards the anchor that you just dropped. You can always also use it in your advantage, obviously, if you know this, but if you want to make sure that everyone can say what they want to say, then be very careful with all the anchors that you're dropping in sessions. And the last cognitive bias that is very much present in mainly collaborative modeling sessions, but also in the teams that Kenny and I encounter, is this false consensus effect. And basically every team has the best model in the world. And it's this effect is really about overestimating the extent in which others share your beliefs, opinions, and enthusiasm. So you came up with a solution or a model, and maybe you've worked on it for weeks or months or maybe even years, and you are very convinced about well, that it's great, it's the best solution you've ever built. But that also leaves a lot of room for assumptions, and maybe false assumptions as well. So you have to get your your assumptions and your solutions challenged, and you have to make sure that every once in a while you switch around within teams, right? Make sure that there comes a hurry on board. Make sure that people can come up with fresh perspectives and ideas to make sure that your model is still very good, but it's also realistic. So as said, there are a lot of cognitive biases. There's a whole codex going on online, which is very useful and very interesting if you want to know more. If you want to read more on it, I would definitely recommend the book Thinking Fast and Slow from Danielle Kahneman. But here are some of the highlights based on the 3 cognitive biases that we just saw on how you can create and include new insights and counter these cognitive biases that are going on. So embracing the hurries in your team and organization, because they will come up with very weird ideas probably, but you will be able to use something from that. You can also force yourself to come up with these ideas by modeling it wrong. It will bring you a lot, and besides that is also very, very fun. Drop your anchor consciously, especially if you're high in rank. And one very important thing is that you should always leave room for individual contribution. That's also why, for example, during an event storm, we always start with some time for individuals to put all their knowledge and all their perspectives on stickies without talking. First, write it down for yourself, stick it on the wall, and then start discussing it. Because again, if someone would walk up to the wall and place the first sticky, everyone will move to that anchor. Identify and check assumptions, obviously, and consider the possibility that your model is not the best, and that's always a hard one. But yeah, it's a nice one. So these are just a few pointers that you can be aware of in the next session that you go into. Yeah, and if there's way more on the cognitive biases aspect, and we are happy to share some more information about that. All right.
Yeah. So who decides now, right? We got all the insights possible for a model, but how do we decide? Well, eventually you'll end up with 2 solutions, under or over, which is a straw man, actually. Some people don't care. But toilet paper, under or over, right? This is the interesting part. And what is also happening with solutions is that once we talk about solutions, we cannot see the why anymore, usually. We're just talking about my solution, and I want it this way. So Evelyn is more about the over, which is the pattern, right? We're going to go into technicality. If the pattern says you need to do it, but I have a cat.
It's the only way, Kenny. It's the only way.
But I have a cat, and that one doesn't really work with a cat because there's scraping it off too much. And this has something to do with accurate versus completeness, right? If we're talking to each other, we always want to be accurate and not complete. The problem is with accuracy is that it's ignoring a lot of other stuff. For instance, if you say this is a rabbit and I will say it's a duck, well, then it's not really a dialogue anymore, right? It's a discussion. But we cannot see the other one until we unsaw our solution. So sometimes we need to let go of the solution. Now this one is really easy, right? You can quickly switch if I told you that there's a duck and a rabbit. But I only see gold and blue on this next slide, right? And there's really a problem there because I cannot see, and also you have colorblind people, right? They cannot actually experience and see it. And that's the problem. We believe that other people might see it the same way, but it's actually not. Everyone sees it in their own way. But usually all these collaborative modeling sessions or meetings we do nowadays are clear discussions. They're about thinking fast, right? And Evelyn just talked about thinking fast and thinking slow. The book, this is the same thing. Acting, thinking fast is a discussion. You need to convince, take a stand, but we need to start with the dialogue first. That's really important in here, right? So if you want to go into ranking and bias, start with the dialogue. Insights, understanding, listen, think together with others, not against. The questions are central, investigate and check. And this is what we usually don't do because we see it from many perspectives and everyone is holding the truth. And the thing is, why are we doing this? Is because we don't like conflicts, right? We're not so good at dealing with conflicts. We usually ignore them, suppress them, oppress them, whatever. The thing about peace is that it's not the absence of conflict. Conflicts are the status quo. It is how you manage them is what makes peace. Yeah. So to be able to identify all the parts, and we already talked about this, and allow them to speak all the parts in the groups, even the ones we really don't like, toilet paper under, Evelyn, needs to be present, right, in our solution. Maybe we don't choose them, but at least they must be heard, they must be seen. And that's why, again, making everything visual, what we see a lot during these collaborative modeling is that people discuss or put a dialogue, but they're discussing invisible things. Make it visible. Make it talk. If you discuss which model is better, make them both on the whiteboard. It's cheap. It's cheaper than refactoring your code, right? So when you go to who to invite, right? Who do I invite in this collaborative session? It's not thinking in terms of people. It's thinking in terms of percepting. Who is the Hari? Who is the person with a perception that is not yours? Especially these annoying people, right? Who believes it's toilet paper over. Right, so but think of that. I like these people, even though I know I get into a conflict. I like bringing these people in and managing the conflict, because conflict is like failing, right? It's an opportunity to learn and see the other people. And that's why the concept of a meeting should change. It shouldn't be a meeting where we discuss, sit around a square table. It should be an open round table, for instance, if you want to sit, or a whiteboard. The good thing about the whiteboard, like I have here, right? If I put things on the whiteboard, I'm not discussing it with you anymore. I'm pointing to the whiteboard. So we are together facing the whiteboard and discussing things on the whiteboard. While if you're in a table, you're in a conflict. You're looking at each other and battling against each other, and not against the ideas that are on the whiteboard again. So it's getting personal instead of putting it on the whiteboard. And that's why you should get the metaphor of meeting as a campfire, right? Because what happens in these group discussions is that there's a conscious level of the group and there's an unconscious level here. And the wisdom and potential is downside. If we're just discussing solutions, we're not getting to the core, to the why of what people have. We call it the undercurrent, right? We need to talk about how people see the solution rather than how it is. So stop talking about the facts, but why do you want it? And what do you think about it? And maybe if you're there and in your situation, how do you feel about us going this way? But feeling is sometimes a hard one to discuss. That's why you need to create that psychological safety. And that's hard. It's complex, it's social. But Deep Democracy, the Lewis method, has some steps you can follow and incorporate in your facilitation, right? So the first thing is to gain all views. So just ask, okay, who has something to say, right? And then you always ask, okay, who can relate a bit to it? And just keep quiet, because other people can relate to it. Many of the times you spoke out into a group and everyone stays quiet. You don't know if they agree or disagree or slightly agree. So if I just make it explicit, especially online now, who recognizes themselves a bit in that thing they just said, right? And then just raise your hand. This already creates understanding with each other. And then ask, okay, who sees it differently, right? Make it safe to say the alternative views. And then spread that, keep spreading that alternative as much as possible, right? Who recognizes a bit of that? And people will talk. And the most important thing, if you vote, if you come to a deep democratic vote, right, a majority, always ask, what will it take for you to go along? Usually we vote, there's a majority, okay, we go for that and we walk out the room. But you know what we said before, right? That's an autocratic decision and people will sabotage. Instead, I will ask people, what does it take for you to go along? They will say, well, if you go that way, I really need this, and then I can go along. Okay, can we add that to the solution? Yes? Okay, let's do it. Really important. And how much space you give is also important, right? So you have 4 ways of going into a decision making: idea, suggestion, proposal, or command. Now, you can still go into a room and say, this is what we're going to do, which is fine. Just say it to me, clear, and ask me, what do I need to go along? Perfect. But usually what happens is that people already have a proposal or a command, and do it as if I can just bring in ideas. Don't do that. Just ask, this is my proposal. If you don't find any risk, we're going to do this. What does it need for you to take along? Huh? So think about that. So who decides? Try to use these steps, right? Try to spread the why of the solution. Why do people want the solution? If you can agree on the why, on the pain, then it's easier to come up with a solution and pick another solution, right? And always ask people, what does it require you to go along with this? So then the last part, Evelyn, right? How do we deal with these issues of when we keep cycling back?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and this is also where a concept that's called polarities come in, and that's a very interesting one, actually. Something that we started to use in our workshops as well. Very often we encounter situations or problems that we think have a very clear solution. It's either or, but in some cases you have problems that doesn't seem to have a clear solution, right? And we have to have the both and approach there. So for example, sometimes we get the question, yeah, but when can we stop coding, or sorry, when can we stop doing the collaborative modeling part and actually start doing the coding part? And that's something that we call a polarity, because to us it's not either or, right? It's both sides of a polarity, and you have to find a way of managing that. You have to find a way of moving around between a polarity and see when it's time to go from one side to the other side. And as said, polarities can be mapped, and there's a very useful tool that you can use there, and that's this template. And it's coming from this book that's also visualized on the right of the screen. And this is a very easy way of mapping a polarity. So don't do this for every problem. Some problems do have a very clear either or solution. If Kenny and I would be going to a restaurant tonight, which we finally can again in the Netherlands, and we are choosing the restaurant, it's either this or that. It's not about like, yeah, but maybe we can move around between the restaurants. Yeah, we can, but this is a pretty simple solution to a problem. But when it comes to, for example, should we do collaborative modeling or coding? Should we work from home or should we work in the office? That sort of problems really are polarities that require management. So it's not a problem to be solved, it's a polarity that needs to be managed. And this canvas, you can use that to actually map it out. So you can fill in both the positive and negative effects from both sides of the polarity, and it forces you and the group or the people with who you are doing this with to actually take a look at all the different sides of this polarity and see, okay, so when is it useful to use this, and when is it useful to move to the other side of it? Then you can also use the signals and observations on the bottom part of this. And if you start to observe this, if you start to see these signals, then that means for you as a team that it's time to move to the other side and take these actions. So this is a very easy way of recognizing what's going on within your team and see how the polarity should be managed. And we also wrote a blog about this, so which takes you through this step by step. So I think we can share that as well somewhere. But we very often use this, and you can do this very quickly. It doesn't take long, but it really forces you to take a look at this polarity from multiple perspectives and decide where are we now and what should we do. Yeah, I think
we're
we
done.
are almost going to the end of our presentation. Well, not before we have had the best slide of this presentation, but that will come after this. So these are some of the stuff that we discussed in this presentation to ensuring this flow in meetings. Being able to create awareness of people, their ranks within the group, be very aware of that, especially start with your own rank, see where you are compared to others in the group, own, play and share that rank, be aware and make the cognitive biases that are there explicit. As said, we discussed 3 in this session, there are way more. But if you start with these 3, start observing them, start calling them out, and start challenging them, I think you'll be off to a good start. The deep democracy, the Lewis method in your decision making. How do you make this decision? Always ask what they need to come along, and start recognizing some polarities that are living within your team, within your organization, and see how you can fill in one of the maps that we showed you to get started with that. And that really marks the end of the presentation, but we always end with our guests, because they are way better in judging than we are. We try not to judge, we leave that to them. And it's 55, Kenny, so we managed to finish on time. That's also good good for us.
Let's see if we have some questions.
Yeah, we were not sure if there were any questions, so we wanted to leave some room for it if there were. But we see that Paul's back, so that's good.
I cannot hear.
double the mute just in case, because I have architect's Tourette's, so which is why I've been doing this for 20 years, because I can't stop from talking when architects are in the room. This is amazing. I got a couple of questions from the audience, and I think that they're kind of going again into the same kind of thing, which is flow, right? Agility, agile architecture, delivery, it's all about flow. And yet this is like a lot of things we do as architects, there's a sort of whoa check, are we doing this right? Thinking a little more. So are we slowing things down? Are we is deep democracy effective in the sense of where's the value creation come from? And that one I think is a very interesting question, because we both argue about time as well as value, as well as then wanting to respect and find that unique idea.
Yeah, so to go in on that, I think I can answer that. So architects, like myself, are usually about trade-offs, right? They're managing a lot of trade-offs in the architecture itself. The only thing is, the way I see it as a metaphor is now you take responsibility then, right, to yourself, while the group needs to sometimes execute it. So what I want to do is switch that responsibility constantly to the group, and have the groups be aware of these trade-offs, be aware of, for instance, a very good example is teams generally focus on, well, 2 to 3 months ahead, right, with sprints. So let's say you want to have the team do architecture themselves. The problem is they don't know what's happening on a longer scale. Let's say we need to scale up and we need to recruit. So then it's my job as an architect in between to know that and sync that with the CTO and try to go to the teams and with them say, this is going to happen. So we need to go to a technology that's more recruitable. What are your ideas? By the way, we need to have this fast, so there's a time constraint, but we're actually doing this and we need it by next week. So I'm setting constraints on the decision making there, right? But I'm saying it is we are doing this. And that's creating the flow with the group, right? I'm like John Boyd's OODA loop. I'm closing the feedback loop much quicker and putting the information of the architecture much quicker towards the people who have it. So you're more of a person that's in between, managing the knowledge towards the teams, right? And by that creating flow and managing the decisions as well. So that doesn't mean you don't take decisions anymore. I still believe you as an architect need to make decisions. You do, because you have usually a longer time span, like levels of work, than teams have. You still need to do that, in my opinion. Ruth and Dana create a very brilliant post about that. You still need to do that. So for me, it's an illusion that you don't take decisions anymore. But which decision do the teams need to make by themselves with you? And which decision do you take and you need to inform in a correct way? Right? But close the feedback loop and close that buy-in. And that's how you can create flow, to put the responsibility more towards the people that should have the responsibility of making that decision, but also help them, right? Because they're not used to doing that. So it's not all of a sudden, hey team, good luck. You're now in charge of this decision. No, help them, see if they can.
That's interesting, because that also goes into things like authority boards or other kinds of team decision making. So how do you scale these methods across sort of large solution kinds of engagements? And it's got to be a 1-minute question, because otherwise I'm taking it.
So one thing.
How about, does this scale well?
Yeah, it can. If you put the structure in place, right? A big thing is architectural decision records. But we do a lot of sense making. How can I keep track of what's happening in a structured way? So if I can get my information in a structured way, I can also spot, observe, just like we have observability for systems, we should also have observability for our teams in a social technical system. So that's how I see it. You need to have this, you need to give the structure together in order to keep observing what's going on. and created coherency.
Wonderful. Evelyn, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we sign off and go?
No, I think I agree, and it's very often like indeed like, okay, so but flow and time and trade-offs, but having these very short feedback loops and doing it this way also prevents this sabotage line or the resistance line that we saw from running. So it also allows you to catch up stuff very early on in processes or and thereby increasing the flow. So it's a trade-off, but it's also a very helpful one in this case. Yeah.